Good evening, everyone. We're so glad you're here tonight for the first of our C.S. Lewis kind of Holy Week and Easter series, preparing us for this holy season as we talk this week about the dying and rising God, and next week about dying and rising man. And so I want to let you know that following today's lecture, or talk, I guess we want to call it, he's not really going to lecture us, is he? But you're all welcome to join us downstairs in the Bishop White Library, where we will have a very simple Lenten supper. And so, again, that's going to be just kind of down there through the hall and the steps, or you can even go around the building and into the Bishop White courtyard that way. And now it's my privilege and my joy to welcome Dr. Stewart Goetz, a member here at Washington Memorial Chapel and a C.S. Lewis expert. He is Professor Emeritus at Ursinus in Collegeville in the Philosophy Department, and he's also visiting scholar and professor at St. Peter's College in Oxford, and we look forward to learning more about the death and resurrection of our Lord through the lens of C.S. Lewis. Thank you, Dr. Goetz.
For the simple meal, I like my steak medium rare. What are we having tonight? Yeah. Okay. I don't know how many of you know much about Lewis. There was somebody in this week to the church and thought C.S. Lewis was going to be giving the talk. And I thought, well, if there's somebody like that here tonight, this is going to be a battle. No, Lewis was born in 1898, and he died in 1963 on the day that Kennedy was assassinated. And 100 years to this, back in 1925, in the autumn of this year, he assumed his professional role at Magdalen College, Oxford. So this is the 100th anniversary of Lewis's taking up his position in Oxford. Now, what I'm basically going to do tonight is just give you an overview of his thought, not my thought, Lewis's thought on the idea of the dying and rising God. And if you can't hear me, let me know, because my wife always says they can't hear you. And so if you can't hear me, let me know. It's not a talk on the atonement. Lewis himself never had a firm view of the atonement. And my wonderful wife, Carolyn, back here, she's making a list of the books in the Bishop White Library, right, is what it's called. And she comes across some really interesting stuff. If you ever want to time travel, go into the past, if you can ever find an old library, it's a great way to time travel. In the library downstairs, are we in there tonight for the soup? There are a bunch of books in there that she volunteered to try and draw up a list on. Now, one of them was a guy by the name Walter Carey, and she brings these things home. I know. And she says, she'll say, listen to this. So this was Walter Carey. She was reading it aloud to me last night. He wrote it in 1914. He was about the atonement in this book. He says, it's necessary to remember that while the church has always insisted that sin was conquered and atonement made by the death of Christ, yet there's never been an official theory or explanation of the atonement. And that was actually Lewis's view. I emailed a guy named Michael Ward, who works on Lewis in Oxford, and I asked Michael this morning, I said, did you know Lewis ever read Walter Carey? And he says, not to my knowledge. He says, I've never heard of the guy. But he was the head librarian, Carey was, looked up his biography a bit, at the Pusey House, Oxford, where to this day the C.S. Lewis Society in Oxford meets in Pusey House. If you want to get Lewis's take on the atonement, and this is the last thing I'm going to say about it because this talk is not on the atonement, he has a chapter in Mere Christianity called The Perfect Penitent, which is about the atonement, and he throws out an idea. He says, if it works for you, great. If it doesn't, no problem. He says, it's a mysterious issue. And then in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, his probably his most famous children's story, the Narnia stories, when he has Aslan slaughtered, put to death on the stone. And there's a sense that Lewis thought a plausible view of the atonement was what's known as the ransom theory, where some price is paid to buy us out of sin or the devil. But Lewis never officially endorsed the ransom theory. Now, when we go through this tonight, I'm going to quote a good bit of Lewis because I think it's always nice to hear what he actually said. Because he was a great writer. If you ever get interested seriously reading Lewis, well, one thing you need to understand is he believed in the integrity of an ordinary person's mind. He thought our minds work well. What bothered him about philosophers was that they always questioned what the ordinary person believes. Lewis wanted to be a professor, or a don in Oxford in philosophy. He could not secure a position in philosophy, and he ended up on the English faculty. But it was interesting what he wrote to his father after his appointment to the English faculty in Oxford. And he said this, he says, I'm rather glad of the change. I've come to think that if I had the mind, I have not the brain and nerves for a life of pure philosophy, a perpetual questioning of all that plain men take for granted. Is that the best life for temperaments such as ours? So Lewis's temperament, with regard to the beliefs of ordinary people, was going to be relevant to what he thought about the idea of a dying and rising God. But Lewis, although he was on the English faculty, he was a philosopher. It remained throughout his life his first love. So remember also this when we read a few things here tonight. Some of you here tonight might think something like the following. I just made this up. Why did Lewis have to think about this dying and rising God stuff? Why complicate things? It's all so simple. Jesus died for my sins. Have faith. Believe. Exclamation point. Now, Lewis was all too aware of this kind of view. In his book, Letters to Malcolm, which was written at the end of his life. Indeed, I think it was published the year after he died. Lewis covered a host of topics. It's one of the best things I think he ever wrote. He's on prayer, science, the soul, free will, happiness. But at the beginning of chapter 15, it's interesting what he says. Letters to Malcolm, just so if you haven't ever read it, most people haven't, they don't even know it exists. Malcolm is this fictitious interlocutor with Lewis. So Lewis is writing to this sounding board, basically, And here's what he says about what he's doing in the book. He says, quote, "I'm making very heavy weather of what most believers find a very simple matter. Yes, but it depends upon who one is. For those in my position, adult converts from the intelligentsia, that simplicity can't always be the starting point. One can't just jump back into one's childhood. We have to work back to the simplicity, a long way around." So as a member of the, what he called the intelligentsia, these people in higher ed, dare I say, Lewis had been schooled, this is what he was schooled in, to question the truth of ordinary beliefs. And it took a lot of intellectual effort for him to work his way back to understanding the soundness of ordinary belief. So while he believed in the integrity of the ordinary person's mind, he'd been schooled to question everything the ordinary person believed, and hence he said, I have to work my way back, and it's hard. So those, if here tonight, say, this is also simple. Why think about it this way? Lewis would say, well, bear with me. I don't question what you believe, but if you had my history, you would understand I need to work my way back. Now, education, Lewis believed, if done rightly, is not about politics. It's not about indoctrination. It's basically concerned with seeking the explanation of things. And as he understood it, explanation is broadly concerned with trying to make sense out of things. Trying to understand how things fit together, how they are intelligible. And in his book, Miracles, he quoted a British astrophysicist, Arthur Eddington, and he said that we sometimes have convictions which we cherish but can't justify. We are influenced by some innate sense of the fitness of things. If in giving such weight to the sense of fitness I were doing something new, I should feel rather nervous. In reality, I'm merely giving formal acknowledgement to a principle which is always used by all people. So Lewis thinks all of us are constantly trying to make sense out of things. We're seeking intelligibility. We're seeking to put things together so that they fit in the right way. They go together. Now, he was also a person who thought that we shouldn't be surprised about things in Christianity that can be found in other religions. He thought that if there was something in Christianity that were really out of whack, you just didn't find it anywhere else, he thought that would be deeply suspicious if things worked that way. Now, he looked at morality, and he reflected on the similarities between Christian and non-Christian morality. He pointed out that many people believe Christianity is ultimately the announcement of a teaching or a new moral code that you don't find anywhere else. He believed this was absolutely false. Now, I'll just quote again Lewis here for you. The idea that Christianity brought a new ethical code into the world is a grave error. If it had done so, then we should have to conclude that all who first preached it wholly misunderstood their own message. For all of them, its founder, his precursor, he's talking about John the Baptist there, his apostles came demanding repentance and offering forgiveness, a demand and an offer both meaningless except on the assumption of a moral law already known and already broken. Essentially, Christianity is not the promulgation of a moral discovery. It's addressed to penitents only to those who admit their disobedience to the known moral law. A Christian who understands his own religion laughs when unbelievers expect to trouble him by the assertion that Jesus uttered no command which had not already been anticipated by the rabbis, few indeed which cannot be paralleled in classical, ancient Egyptian, Ninevite, Babylonian, or Chinese texts. What he did at the end of his book, The Abolition of Man, it was a set of talks he gave about 1942, I think, is he cataloged in the back the similarities between quote-unquote Christian morality and non-Christian morality. And Lewis said, the similarities will just jump off the page for you. So then he thinks, well, if Jesus did not come to teach a new moral code, what, asked Lewis, did he come to do? He says, and this, I'm reading Lewis to you now. Well, as soon as you look into the New Testament or any other Christian writing, you will find they are constantly talking about something different from a common moral code, about his death and his coming to life again. It's obvious that Christians think the chief point of the story lies there. They think the main thing he came to earth to do was to suffer and be killed. When we look up here tonight, we don't find a moral code in the center. You find a cross. And Lewis said, anybody that understands Christianity will understand it's not about novelty in morality. It's about a death and a rising. It's about a cross. Now, he said two people that influenced him in his early life at Oxford about the idea of dying and rising were one, a colleague named T.W. Weldon. And this is what he said about a conversation he had with Weldon. It was about 1925. Lewis is still an atheist at this point, moving toward religious belief. This is what Weldon said, and Weldon's an atheist. Weldon says the following: rum thing, all that about dying God, seems to have really happened once. And this is the atheist Weldon saying this to Lewis. Now, I brought along with me, I bought, I think it was printed on demand, something called The Golden Bough. Lewis read this, Weldon read this. Indeed, almost, I should be careful, a whole host of educated people back in the 1920s were reading this book. My wonderful wife, Carolyn, sometimes I come over while she's drawing up a list of books in the library down here. She comes over to me, I'm working at the table. She says, look at this. And I says, okay, what's that? The Golden Bough. Bishop White has a copy in this library down here of The Golden Bough, which Lewis was reading, Weldon was reading. Indeed, somebody here at the church must have been reading. If you're interested in it, I had her go down and pull it out. She now has a key. She's legit, so she now has a key. She can pull it off the shelf, and I just asked her to get it out. And you can see the book. It was incredibly influential for Lewis and many people who were thinking about this topic back then. The second person that influenced him greatly at this point was his friend Owen Barfield, who basically admonished Lewis to have a more respectful attitude to pagan myth. And Lewis says the question was no longer, after conversing with Barfield, to find one simply true religion among 1,000 religions which were simply false. Quote, it was rather, Where has religion reached its true maturity? Where, if anywhere, have all the hints of paganism been fulfilled? The longer and more sympathetically we study pagan myths, the more we become aware of a common element in many of them. The theme of sacrifice, of mystical communion through the shed blood, of death and rebirth, of redemption. It's all too clear to escape notice. In Fraser's book, I think it was actually something like 20 volumes, if I remember correctly, and they condensed it down. They gave you the edited version of the thing. But Fraser's book, when Carolyn isn't reading to me, I'll pick this up and read to myself. And it's interesting what you find about this idea of the dying God that comes back to life. Now, a myth, as Lewis understood it, was central to religion. I think Lewis believed if you don't have this idea of a myth, of a story or narrative that's fantastic in nature in the sense that there's some type of divine supernatural intervention to accomplish some earthly event, you don't really have religion, I think was Lewis's view. And the central idea of a myth, Lewis thought, was this idea of a dying and rising God, and it could basically be incarnated in many different religions around the planet, on the planet Earth. And hence we shouldn't be surprised, thought Lewis, that we would see different instances of this. He talks about Balder frequently. It was part of a Norse mythology, in how Balder dies. He never actually gets resurrected, but it's possible that he could have come back to life. He talks about Osiris, and again, you find all this in Fraser, an Egyptian god who's killed, gets cut up into pieces, then is reassembled in the underworld, and this becomes tied to the ideas we're going to see of the repetitions of the season every year, where you get the fall where things die, and you get the spring where things come to life. Another one was Adonis, a similar story tied to the calendar and in the cycle of death and coming back to life. So, as was the case with morality, Lewis thinks you find a common moral code outside Christianity and shared by Christians, with Christians. Lewis thought that, quote, we must not be nervous about parallels in pagan Christ. They ought to be there. It would be a stumbling block if they weren't. Given that there are these parallel dying and rising gods in other religions, it should be made clear that we are not pronouncing all other religions to be totally false, but rather saying that in Christ, whatever is true in all religions is consummated and perfected. My conversion, again, I'm just reading you to Lewis here, very largely depended on recognizing Christianity as the completion, the actualization of something that had never been wholly absent from the mind of man. So people who are religious in Lewis's conception of things, with these people we should expect to find ideas of dying and rising gods, sacrifice, blood, death, resurrection. Lewis, again, theology, while saying that a special illumination has been granted to Christians and earlier to Jews, also says that there's some divine illumination granted to all men. The divine light, we are told, lighteneth every man. He's quoting John 1:9 there. We should therefore expect to find in the imagination of great pagan teachers and myth makers some glimpse of that theme which we believe to be the very plot of the whole cosmic story, the theme of incarnation, death, and rebirth. The pagan stories are all about someone dying and rising, either every year or else nobody knows where and nobody knows when. The Christian story is about a historical personage whose execution can be dated pretty accurately under a named Roman magistrate. It is the difference between a real event on the one hand and dim dreams or premonitions of that same event on the other. God became man should involve, from the point of view of human knowledge, the statement, myth became fact. And the pivotal figure, just for those of you who kind of know a bit about Lewis's and his friendships, J.R.R. Tolkien, the Lord of the Rings author, was incredibly influential in Lewis's coming to believe in the idea of myth actually becoming fact in Jesus Christ. And we know Tolkien loved myths. He wrote a great myth. But what was interesting for Lewis through Tolkien was the idea that the myth never ceased to be a myth. The myth became fact. A letter, November 8th, 1931, Lewis wrote to his friend Arthur Greaves. It says the following: I, like you, am worried by the fact that the spontaneous appeal of the Christian story is so much less to me than that of paganism. I think the thrill of the pagan stories may be due to the fact that they are mere beginnings, the first faint whisper of the wind from beyond the world, while Christianity is the thing itself. And no thing, when you have really started on it, can have for you then and there just the same thrill as the first hint. This is only an idea, and it may be all rot, but it seems to fit. And here's the idea: intelligibility, things going together. It seems to fit in pretty well with the general law that things need to die in order to live. Of autumn and spring, sleep and waking, death and resurrection, and whosoever loses his life shall save it. In another letter to Greaves, this is in 1932. By this time, Lewis has definitely believed in God and he's becoming Christian. And he says, Lewis wrote this: if you take the sacrificial idea out of Christianity, you deprive both Judaism and paganism of all significance. Can one believe that there was just nothing in that persistent motif of blood, death, and resurrection, which runs like a black and scarlet cord through all the greater myths, through Balder and Dionysius, Adonis, and the Grail too? Surely the history of the human mind hangs together better if you suppose that all this was the first shadowy approach of something whose reality came with Christ. Even if we can't at present fully understand that something. Thus, as with his belief about Christianity and the new moral code, Lewis, as I've already said, concluded Christianity is not the announcement of a new religious idea. He believed the Christian religion is an instance of the same kind of thing as is found in other religions, with their focus on death and resurrection, dying to live. Again, I'll quote Lewis: I can't say for certain which practices came into Christianity from earlier religions. An enormous amount did. I should find it hard to believe Christianity if that were not so. I couldn't believe that 999 religions were completely false and the remaining one true. In reality, Christianity is primarily the fulfillment of the Jewish religion, but also the fulfillment of what was vaguely hinted at in all religions at their best. What was vaguely seen in them all comes into focus in Christianity. You get scattered through the heathen religions all over the world, but still quite vague and mythical, the idea of a God who is killed and then comes to life again. Then in the New Testament, the thing really happens. The dying God really appears in a historical person, living in a definite place and time. We must not be nervous about parallels in pagans' Christ. They ought to be there. And then finally, he repeatedly goes back to nature itself in thinking about this idea of dying and rising. He says, the doctrine of death which I describe is not peculiar to Christianity. Nature herself has written it large across the world in the repeated drama of the buried seed and the re-arising corn. From nature, perhaps, the oldest agricultural communities learned it. With animal or human sacrifices showed forth for centuries the truth that without the shedding of blood, there is no remission. And though at first such conceptions may have concerned only the crops and the offspring of the tribe, they came later in the mysteries to concern the spiritual death and resurrection of the individual. The Indian, think here now, India, the Indian ascetic, mortifying his body on a bed of spikes, preaches the same lesson. Mr. Aldous Huxley expounds non-attachment. We cannot escape the doctrine of dying and rising by ceasing to be Christians. It's an eternal gospel revealed to men wherever men have sought or endured the truth. It is the very nerve of redemption which wisdom at all times and in all places lays bare. Peculiarity of the Christian faith is not to teach this doctrine, but to render it in various ways more tolerable. Christianity teaches us that the terrible task has already, in some sense, been accomplished for us, that a master's hand is holding ours as we attempt to trace the different letters, and that our script need only be a copy, not an original. And I'll finish basically here, then to sum up. In 1921, again, this is long before he's become a Christian. He had a friend at Oxford. He had so many interesting friends at Oxford. You read about these people. Went on, did just incredible things. A guy named Leo Baker, 1921, shared a book with Lewis entitled The Gospel of Buddha. And here's Lewis's response to his friend Leo Baker. Thanks for the gospel of Buddha. Insofar as it is a gospel, an exposition of ethics, it hasn't perhaps added much to what I know of the subject, though it has been very pleasant reading. On the metaphysical presuppositions of Buddhism, it has given me new light. I did not realize before his denial of the soul or self. That is very interesting. I cannot at present believe it. To me, the self as really existing seems involved in everything we think. No use of talking of bundles of thoughts, etc. For as you know, I've always have to ask, who thinks? Indeed, Buddhism itself does not seem to make much of the non-soul doctrine once it's been stated. And it is only by torture that the story of rebirth is compatible with it. Perhaps he's confused the moral truth with the metaphysical fallacy. One sees, of course, its inferiority to Christianity. At any rate, a creed for ordinary men. And though I sometimes feel the complete abnegation is the only real refuge, in my healthier moments, I hope there is something better. This minute I can pine for nirvana. What is nirvana? It's nothingness. I can pine for nirvana, he says at a moment like this, but when the sky clears, I shall prefer something with more positive joy. So Lewis learned early in the 1920s that Buddhism had a weird twist to this dying, and rising idea. Buddhism took the idea of dying and, in Lewis's mind, twisted it to equate with you don't even exist. There is no you that persists through time. And what you need to do is come somehow to the realization that you don't exist, that you're dead. And it's only in this way that you can rise to get to nirvana, which is absolutely nothingness. And Lewis said, this is so contrary to the views of ordinary people that he just couldn't accept it. Next week, I want to look at Lewis's belief. He thought it was a general law, we'll think of a general principle, that something in order to live must first die, applies to ourselves. So next week the title is The Dying and Rising Self, as it applies to each one of us. He will make additional sense, and this is what he's doing. As he matures in his thought, he's going to try and make additional sense out of the idea of the dying and rising God in terms of the purpose of life and how it's fulfilled. Now, just a snippet, if you've been here in the past couple of years, you've heard this before. Lewis thought the purpose of life, what you are created for, is to be perfectly happy. And Lewis came to believe that what the dying and rising God stories were all about was rooted in the truth that each of us as an individual will only reach the perfect happiness that we desire by dying to our own pursuit of that happiness. So Lewis will try to make sense out of, make intelligible, fit things together in terms of ultimately the purpose of life and the need to die to ourselves in order to reach the perfect happiness that we all, in his mind, crave. And he says, if you were to cease to be Christian, you can never escape the dying and rising God truth. Because if you cease to be Christian, you do not cease to be human. And to be human includes the desire to be perfectly happy. And you will strive, you will struggle to try and find happiness, even if you were to cease to be Christian. And what the Buddhists, what the pagans were really all about, ultimately in their dying and rising God stories, the Buddha trying to find enlightenment through the denial of the existence of the self, they're all trying to reach. It gets twisted, Lewis thinks. They're all it's because they're human. They can't escape the need to die to their self, to get the happiness that they truly desire, and they will never cease to desire it. So that's for next week. We now hopefully don't die when we go down to eat the food that's been prepared for us, which will be wonderful food. And thanks for coming out. The beauty of having a meal after the talk is you don't have to take your breaks. You have a question? my position.
Listen before he became Christian. How much did the dying and rising God and the myth and fact factor into him becoming a Christian himself?
Hugely. How much before Lewis, how important was it to Lewis before he became Christian, this dying and rising God issue? It was hugely important. He's reading The Golden Bough. Again, there's a copy of this book in the library down there. He's reading The Golden Bough 10 years before he becomes Christian. He's reading about these myths. He's exploring Buddhism. He's, in our language, looking for the meaning of life. Broad term, but that's basically what he's doing. He meets Tolkien. Lewis takes his position in 1925. I believe he becomes very close with Tolkien about 1927. And Tolkien's an incredibly interesting character. Lewis describes him in not very flattering terms. But one thing Tolkien was working on Lewis about was Lewis's fascination with these pagan myths. And yet, Lewis, in some ways, always tried to dismiss the Christian story when Tolkien believed the very things that fascinated Lewis about in these pagan myths was at the heart of the Christian story. And why couldn't Lewis accept the idea that myth, this story, this narrative about dying and rising gods, could have actually happened, where the myth becomes fact? And there was a famous, those are involved in Lewisania, all these things. Lewis took a night walk at Magdalen College with Tolkien. It went to almost 4 a.m, and it was basically the pivotal event in the conversion of C.S. Lewis to Christianity. But the subject of the walk was this very topic.
I wonder how much influence William Temple had on Lewis. Do you know of any correspondence, or I'm thinking especially of William Temple's commentary on the Gospel of John, and especially his commentary on John 1, where he identifies the Logos as this integrating principle throughout humankind before the incarnation. And I wonder if that's a little bit of what might be also going on with Lewis and his understanding of myth, the various truths that are still available through simply kind of being human in creation, general revelation and such. Did William Temple and his ideas there of the Logos, the integrating reason that exists because of the Logos involvement in the mind of all human beings, play into C.S. Lewis's understanding of the dying and rising God that he was speaking of?
Okay, I'm going to have to be a little speculative. I emailed Michael Ward this morning. Michael Ward, for those of you, he's in Oxford. He's probably regarded for just general knowledge of Lewis. If you want to have a question, I can get to Michael. He knows me, so I just asked him this morning about this other guy. I don't remember in Lewis's writings, his published works, much reference at all, if any, to Temple. I think I do remember in his letters that he might have mentioned Temple, but don't quote me on that, okay? I could take a look.
I say that because that thought came to mind. It sounded so similar, and they were contemporaries. With him being, I think, about, 15 years older than Lewis, and Archbishop of York being Canterbury in the 40s, early 40s.
Yeah, most of Lewis's formative thought about this came before he was Christian. I mean, that's what's interesting. It was not post-Christian, it was pre-Christian, and it's actually what led him into Christianity. So I think I can say reliably that Temple did not play a pivotal role, but yet I think I have seen mentions of temple by Lewis just in letters, but I'd have to verify that. It's not a very good answer, but it's the best I can do. Yes? Somebody's going to say, I can't hear the question. Okay. Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. I'm not a specialist on these other religions. I just largely read Lewis. I try to read what he read. I'm not completely successful there, but I can say pretty authoritatively, you don't see a lot. In Lewis, I don't remember any distinctive references to Zoroastrianism. But I think if I am just trying to be Lewis right now, I think he would say, it shouldn't surprise us at all if we find it there. Indeed, it would be a surprise if it weren't there. Okay, now, I like my steak medium rare.